This is Chicago's Morning Answer with Dan Proft and Amy Jacobson on AM 560. The Answer.
Top of the morning, Dan and Amy. A couple weeks ago on Yahoo News Skullduggery podcast, Alexandria Ocasio-Cortez was asked top three items on the bill of particulars for Trump impeachment. And she said Russian collusion, sort of. She feels he committed tax fraud. And then she couldn't come up with the third. She said there's just a bunch of things. The tax cuts, the census. She mentioned the census, too. These are apparently impeachable offenses, according to her. Doubtful that anybody would take up her cause that the census or tax cuts passed by Congress, signed into law by the president, would be high crimes and misdemeanors.
That's crazy.
But there is a Supreme Court case, New York v. Department of Commerce, that the Supreme Court is going to hear. They've heard this month. They're going to adjudicate. And this is the controversy. Should there be a question as to a person's citizenship on the census? The Constitution and the statutory code seems pretty straightforward on the topic, but that's not the perspective of everyone. For more on this topic in this case, we're pleased to be joined by Garrett Epps. He is the SCOTUS correspondent for The Atlantic, theatlantic.com. He's also a law professor at the University of Baltimore School of Law, and he is the he's the author of the book, The Shad Treatment. Garrett Epps, thanks so much for joining us. Appreciate it.
Hey, great to be here.
So you wrote in The Atlantic about this case, NYB Department of Commerce, and you suggest it's going to the decision will affect every aspect of national life. How so?
Well, first of all, it determines how many members of Congress each state will receive after the 2020 census. And some states will gain and some states will lose. And so each, having been involved in litigation over these individual seats being spread out among states, I can tell you every single member of Congress is coveted by states and makes a difference because, remember, the number of House seats a state has also determines its strength in the Electoral College. So that's the first step, political. But secondly, numbers as reflected by the census have a lot to do with the distribution of federal grant programs, which are given out on a sort of per capita basis to states or localities. You know, you have X number of people living here, you get Y percent of the total appropriation for health care or policing or infrastructure or things like that. And of course, eventually the census figures will affect the distribution of seats in the state legislatures as well. So political power follows the census, and so does money. It's a pretty powerful combination.
What would the argument be against having a citizenship question on the census when you have to be a citizen in order to vote?
Well, the census, the United States Census is unique in the world in the sense that it is dictated by the text of the Constitution. The framers of the Constitution wanted to make sure that America didn't end up like Britain, in which Parliament just handed out seats any way it chose to. So you literally had towns with 7 voters in them that had 2 members of Parliament, huge cities like Manchester or Birmingham that would have less than 1. They said the census must be conducted every 10 years, and they said representatives, that is members of the House, shall be distributed among the states according, quote, to their respective numbers, meaning the people living in the states. Now, they made an exception in the original Constitution. They said, don't count so-called Indians not taxed, and only count slaves as 3/5.
Right.
Both of those qualifications have now fallen away. They're no longer, slavery no longer exists. There are no Indians not taxed. So basically, we have the constitutional command, respective numbers. It doesn't say numbers of citizens. And of course, we definitely need data on the number of citizens, but the goal of the census form, the so-called short form questionnaire, is to find out how many people live in a given locality, regardless of citizenship or anything else. And that's the way that the seats in Congress are to be distributed because the Constitution says so. This is not really something we need to argue the ins and outs of. The framers made themselves pretty clear.
And then Title 13 of the U.S. Code, passed by Congress in keeping with its responsibility to direct the census, empowers the Secretary of Commerce. The Secretary shall take a decennial census of the population as the first day of April of such year, in such form and content as he may determine. So wouldn't that give the Secretary of Commerce wide berth on the questioning?
You need to quote a good deal more of Title 13 before you close the door.
Including the use of sampling procedures and special surveys.
Congress has been pretty explicit about the procedures to be used in determining what questions shall be used. And among other things, Congress said that no question shall be asked on the short form unless a determination is made that it's necessary for the purpose of the census. And that is not just verbiage. That's a very important administrative law principle. So the consequence of which, as I read it, and I think a lot of people read it, is the following. It might be that a census question on the short form would be valuable. There's a question about that, which I'll come to in a minute. But the Secretary has to determine that it's necessary. And there are procedures, internal and governed by regulation, of how that is to be done. That is to say, studies are to be conducted, and among other things, the conclusion needs to be reached that it will make the census more accurate. Now, there's two problems with this particular question. The first is the determination that it was necessary was never properly made. Secretary of Commerce Wilbur Ross arrived in the office as Secretary of Commerce. He had consulted with Steve Bannon and Chris Kobach, two sort of anti-immigrant figures in the orbit of the administration, and he told people around him he wanted the citizenship question. What needs to happen then, according to the census rules, is studies need to be conducted to determine whether that question would make the census more or less accurate. Every study that the census had, the professional demographers and statisticians in the Census Bureau, said it would cause a significantly less accurate count because people would just throw the form away instead of answering the question because they'd be afraid of attracting the attention of the immigration authorities, and that it might be as many as 5% of non-citizens who would answer the form, 5% fewer, with that question on it. So the answer came back, this will not make the census better. The second problem was that ordinarily these questions are put on the form in response to requests from other parts of the government. And quite the opposite happened here. Secretary Ross, this political appointee, very, very concerned with getting a census citizenship question on the census, began to call around to other bureaus and say, could you please ask us to put this question? We need someone to ask us to put this question on so we can do it. They called the Department of Homeland Security, who said, well, no, this doesn't have anything to do with us. And they called the Department of Justice, which initially said the same thing. Secretary Ross then appealed to Attorney General Sessions and said, basically, I need this. Will you do me this favor? And a letter was then sent saying, we need this information to enforce the Voting Rights Act. That's never been in 50 years of the Voting Rights Act. The Justice Department has never sought that information before. So there's three problems. One is they didn't follow their own procedures. The second is their own studies show it will make the census less valuable. And the third thing is they lied about how the question got there. So it raises a lot of serious questions about whether, in fact, the motivation for this question is not simple politics, that many people believe that a fall off in non-citizen response will result in a shift of political power and financial power to what we might call redder areas rather than blue cities and areas with high immigrant populations. That's quite serious. The census is supposed to be accurate. It's supposed to be non-political. It's supposed to be something we all agree on. Now, no one is saying don't collect information on citizenship. We already have a highly accurate way of measuring that. It's called the American Community Survey, conducted by the Census Bureau, distinct from the short form. The short form is supposed to be filled out by the head of every household in the country. Right. To the extent it isn't, to the extent that households don't answer, the census becomes less accurate.
Well, and a lot of people see that as, big government and it's none of your business. But is there any repercussions if you don't fill out your census form accurately, if you just throw it away?
Well, the only consequence, in theory, you're supposed to answer it and you're supposed to answer it fairly, and there's a law that says that. What happens in reality is if you throw away the short form, then the Census Bureau will try to contact you by phone. And if you don't respond to a phone inquiry, they'll send somebody over to your house and not to knock on the door. Hello, I'm from the census. And if no one answers or they can't get through that way, the Bureau eventually does what they call imputation, and that is they make a statistically reliable guess as to how many people live in that household. So there's no real negative consequence, and there are lots of people who don't answer the short form. That's for sure, but that doesn't necessarily mean it's okay to intentionally make it less accurate.
I'm going to go back to the Supreme Court's adjudication of the case. And here again, we have Congress with the constitutional authority to act that they haven't used. This was Justice Kavanaugh's point. Why, if Congress didn't want the citizenship question to be asked on the census, on the short form, didn't they prohibit asking it the same way they prohibited asking about religion? And in fact, Ruth Bader Ginsburg had a follow-up sort of on this topic. She asked, look, Congress has the primary control over what the census will be, not the executive. Congress has been alerted to the citizenship question for some time. It's done nothing about it. So the question is, who should decide? Congress is silent. Should the court then step in? And the answer, I don't know. Different people are going to answer that differently. But Congress has the authority. They've chosen not to exercise it. So that means they cede it to the high court?
I think that that actually misstates the factual situation, because Congress has used its authority in a very clear and consequential way in the way that lawyers read statutes. They've prescribed reasons for questions. Here are why questions may or may not be included, and they have approved procedures that the Census Bureau should follow. So one of the points I made in my article about this case is, there may actually be a good case for putting a citizenship question on the census form. There could be. We don't know, because the administration didn't bother to make it. They didn't bother to follow the criteria set up by Congress. They lied. They shortcut the procedure. So the question doesn't become, should Congress decide about the question or should the court decide about the question? Congress decided how these questions were to be determined. The administration, apparently for political reasons, declined to follow Congress's instructions. It is very common for courts to step in these administrative law things and say, executive branch, Congress gave you a set of instructions, you didn't follow them, go back and do it again. So I think to some extent that's a kind of a red herring. The issue is, in this case, as it is in many cases, what did Congress's instructions mean? Not did Congress give instructions. Congress has never instructed the Bureau about all the questions on the short form. It's always been the business of the professionals at the Census Bureau, for as long as there's been a Census Bureau, to come up with the questions. And so, the kind of binary, Congress didn't say we can't, so we can, that doesn't really hold up as far as I can tell.
All right. He is Garrett Epps. He's a SCOTUS correspondent for The Atlantic, and he's a law professor at the University of Baltimore School of Law. His book, The Shad Treatment. And Garrett Epps, thanks so much for joining us. Appreciate it.
I enjoyed it.
Take care.
And he joined us on our turnkey.pro answer line.
This is the morning show more Chicago radio listeners are choosing. This is Chicago's Morning Answer on AM 560. The Answer.
Are your windows needy?
Call Crumweedy.
Hi, it's Mike Gallagher. If you need windows, call the exterior experts, Crumweedy. Mark Olson and Greg Olson of Crumweedy run a third-generation family business that's been doing Chicagoland exteriors since 1953. For them, it's all